The cruelest trap is the one disguised as an invitation. The ocean shimmered beyond the glass walls of the wedding venue, waves rolling gently against the California shoreline as guests in tailored suits and designer dresses filled the ballroom with laughter and champagne-fueled conversation. Crystal chandeliers scattered golden light across polished marble floors, creating the kind of luxury that made everything feel perfect from a distance. Naomi Carter paused just inside the entrance, her hand resting lightly against the strap of her evening clutch. She had almost declined the invitation. Almost. But fear no longer controlled her decisions. A hostess greeted her with a professional smile and guided her toward her assigned seat. Naomi followed without question until she noticed where the escort card had placed her. Her steps slowed. The table sat directly beside Ethan Brooke's family. Not near them. Beside them. Close enough for every glance, every whisper, every comparison. For a moment, the noise of the ballroom seemed to soften. Naomi understood immediately. This had never been a simple wedding invitation. It was a performance. And she had been given a front row seat to her own humiliation. She took her chair calmly. Across the room, guests mingled beneath towering floral arrangements while a string quartet played softly in the background. No one paid attention at first. Then someone recognized her. A woman leaned toward another guest. Heads turned. Expressions shifted. Some looked curious. Others looked sympathetic. Naomi had seen those looks before. The looks people gave someone they assumed had lost. A few minutes later, a ripple moved through the crowd near the entrance. Ethan had arrived. Tall, confident, dressed in a custom black tuxedo, he walked through the ballroom with the easy certainty of a man who believed life had rewarded every decision he had ever made. Beside him stood Olivia Hart, his fiancée, radiant beneath the glow of the chandeliers, her diamond engagement ring catching flashes of light with every movement. They stopped every few feet to greet guests. To accept compliments. To be admired. Then Ethan saw Naomi. His smile changed. Didn't they disappear? It sharpened. He excused himself from a conversation and began walking directly toward her table. The closer he came, the quieter the space around Naomi seemed to become. By the time he stopped beside her chair, several nearby guests were openly watching. Ethan slipped one hand into his pocket and smiled down at her. Naomi, he said warmly, almost too warmly. I honestly didn't think you'd come. Naomi met his eyes and returned a polite smile. Congratulations on the wedding. Ethan chuckled softly. That's generous of you. Then his gaze moved around the table before returning to her. By the way, he asked loud enough for others to hear, where's your husband? The question settled over the table like a stone dropped into still water. And suddenly, everyone was listening. For a brief second, the entire table seemed to hold its breath. Naomi could feel eyes turning toward her from every direction. Some curious. Some amused. Some already expecting the answer. Ethan stood beside her chair with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he controlled the room. Olivia remained a few feet away, smiling politely as if the question had been harmless. Naomi slowly set her champagne glass on the table. The crystal touched the white linen with a soft click. Then she looked up at Ethan and smiled. He is on his way. Her voice was calm. No hesitation. No embarrassment. Just certainty. Ethan blinked once before laughing softly. Several guests joined him. Not because the response was funny, but because they assumed it was wishful thinking. Of course he is, Ethan replied. Traffic can be terrible around here. More laughter followed. Naomi simply nodded. The conversation could have ended there. But weddings have a way of bringing out old comparisons. Within minutes, guests began drifting toward the table. Some greeted Naomi warmly. Others greeted her with the careful kindness people reserve for someone they believe deserves sympathy. One woman leaned forward with an expression that felt almost rehearsed. It is good to see you doing well, she said. After everything. Naomi thanked her politely. Another guest asked where she lived now. Someone else asked whether she was still working in consulting. The question sounded innocent. Yet beneath them sat a shared assumption. They believed Ethan had moved forward while Naomi had been left behind. Across the ballroom, photographers followed Ethan and Olivia as they greeted family members. Every flash of light seemed designed to reinforce the same story. The successful couple. The beautiful future. The happy ending. Naomi watched quietly. Years ago, those images would have hurt. Years ago, she might have wondered what she had done wrong. But time had a way of exposing the difference between what looked impressive and what actually mattered. Then Olivia approached the table. Her smile was bright and polished. She greeted everyone before turning to Naomi. "I am so happy you came," she said. "Ethan told me you two stayed friends." The statement landed strangely. Ethan had never called. Never checked in, never asked how she was doing after the divorce. Friendship was not the word Naomi would have chosen. "I wish you both a wonderful wedding," Naomi replied. Olivia glanced briefly at the empty seat beside her. "So your husband is really coming?" she asked. Naomi nodded. "Yes." This time there was no laughter. Used curiosity. Olivia tilted her head slightly. "What does he do?" Naomi looked toward the ballroom entrance. The massive wooden doors remained closed. Beyond them, the ocean sunset painted streaks of gold across the glass walls. "He works hard," she answered. The response only deepened the mystery. At another table, whispers began circulating. Some guessed he was a lawyer. Others assumed he was a doctor. A few quietly wondered whether he existed at all. Ethan overheard the speculation and smirked into his champagne glass. From where he stood, the story remained exactly what he wanted it to be. What he did not realize was that every minute his confidence grew, he was moving closer to a moment he would never forget. The sun continued sinking toward the horizon, painting the Pacific Ocean in shades of gold and amber beyond the ballroom windows. Inside, however, attention had shifted away from the view. Whether people admitted it or not, many of them were now watching Naomi. Not openly. Not constantly. But enough to notice every glance toward the entrance and every passing minute that her husband failed to appear. The wedding coordinator moved gracefully between tables, making final preparations for the ceremony. Servers carried trays of sparkling water and champagne through the crowd. Soft music drifted through the room. Yet beneath the elegance, curiosity had taken hold. At Ethan's table, conversation eventually returned to the subject everyone was quietly thinking about. "How long have you been married?" someone asked Naomi. She looked toward the ocean for a moment before answering. "A little over 2 years." The answer surprised several guests. They had expected hesitation. Instead, she sounded completely comfortable. "What is he like?" another woman asked. Naomi smiled faintly. "King." The woman laughed. "That is all." Naomi nodded. "That is the most important thing." The table fell silent for a moment. It was not the answer anyone expected. Most people described success. Status. Accomplishments. Naomi had chosen kindness. Across the room, Ethan appeared increasingly entertained by the situation. Every time someone glanced toward the entrance, his confidence seemed to grow. Olivia remained pleasant, though even she appeared curious now. The mystery surrounding Naomi's husband had become part of the evening's entertainment. Then one of Ethan's cousins leaned forward with a playful smile. "Come on, Naomi. Give something. What does your husband actually do?" Several heads turned. Naomi gently adjusted the bracelet on her wrist. "He manages a few businesses." "A few businesses," someone repeated. "What does that mean?" Naomi shrugged lightly. "It means he stays busy." Laughter spread around the table again. Not cruel laughter. But the kind that comes when people believe someone is avoiding the truth. Ethan happened to overhear the exchange while speaking with another group nearby. He walked over holding a champagne glass and smiled. "You know what I think," he said. Nobody answered. "I think your husband is not coming." The statement hung comfortably in the air because many people secretly agreed. Ethan took another sip before continuing. "Honestly, Naomi, there is nothing wrong with showing up alone." Olivia touched his arm gently, perhaps sensing the conversation was becoming uncomfortable. But Ethan seemed unable to stop. The audience was too tempting. "You do not have to prove anything to anybody." Naomi looked directly at him. Her expression never changed. "I am not trying to prove anything." For the first time, Ethan's smile faltered slightly. Only slightly. There was something about her calmness that refused to fit the narrative he wanted. Most people would have become defensive. Most people would have explained themselves. Naomi did neither. She simply sat there as though she already knew something no one else knew. Minutes later, the wedding guests began moving toward the ceremony space overlooking the ocean. Rows of white chairs faced a flower-covered arch positioned against the sunset. The atmosphere grew more formal. More focused. Yet even as guests found their seats, whispers continued. Some wondered whether Naomi's husband had cancelled. Others questioned whether he existed at all. Meanwhile, Naomi remained seated near the aisle, her gaze occasionally drifting toward the entrance. Not anxious. Not worried. Waiting. Then, just as the wedding officiant stepped into position and the music shifted for the ceremony to begin, Naomi's phone vibrated softly against her clutch. She glanced at the screen. For the first time all evening, a genuine smile touched her face. And suddenly, waiting no longer looked like uncertainty. The screen displayed only 3 words. "Running a little late." Naomi looked at the message for a moment before locking her phone and slipping it back into her clutch. The smile that touched her face was small, almost invisible, but it changed something inside her. Not because she needed reassurance. Because it reminded her how different life had become. As guests settled into their seats overlooking the ocean, the ceremony preparations continued around her, yet her thoughts drifted elsewhere. There had been a time when silence from someone she loved would have filled her with anxiety. Years ago, she had measured her worth through someone else's attention, someone else's approval, someone else's promises. Back then, she had built her life around Ethan. She remembered late nights in a small apartment outside Chicago, where the heating system rattled through winter evenings and every dollar seemed to have a purpose before it even arrived. She remembered balancing bills at the kitchen table while Ethan talked about future opportunities. Bigger opportunities. Better opportunities. Naomi had believed in every one of them. When Ethan wanted to leave his stable job to pursue a more ambitious career path, she supported him. When money became tight, she picked up additional consulting work. When friends questioned the risk, she defended him. She was never the loudest person in the room, but she was always the one standing behind him. For years, I'd felt enough. Until it did not. Success changed many things. At first, the changes were subtle. More business dinners. More networking events. More conversations that revolved around image, influence, and status. Ethan became increasingly comfortable in rooms filled with powerful people. Naomi was proud of him. At least in the beginning. Then came the distance. Calls that were not returned. Conversations that felt rushed. Promises postponed. The man who once discussed every decision with her slowly became someone who informed her of decisions after they had already been made. The ending itself had not arrived with a dramatic argument. It arrived through accumulation. Through months of feeling less visible. Less necessary. Less valued. By the time the divorce papers were signed, Naomi had already grieved much of the relationship. The hardest part was not losing Ethan. The hardest part was losing the version of herself that believed sacrifice guaranteed loyalty. The memory faded as the sound of the ocean returned. A gentle breeze moved through the outdoor ceremony space. Guests adjusted their jackets and dresses while waiting for the wedding to begin. Naomi sat quietly, watching sunlight dance across the water. What happened after the divorce had surprised everyone, including her. She had not rebuilt her life out of revenge. She had rebuilt it out of necessity. One day at a time. One decision at a time. One morning at a time. Slowly, the pain that once occupied every corner of her thoughts gave way to something unexpected. Peace. Across the aisle, Ethan laughed at something one of his friends said. The sound carried through the evening air. Sago, hearing that laugh might have reopened old wounds. Tonight, it felt distant. Like hearing a song she used to know by heart but no longer recognized. Naomi looked toward the entrance again. Somewhere beyond those doors, her future was making its way toward her. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt grateful that her past had not come with her. The ceremony had not started yet, but Naomi found herself thinking about a different day entirely. A rainy Tuesday afternoon nearly 3 years earlier. She had been carrying a laptop bag and a paper cup of coffee through downtown Seattle when someone accidentally bumped into her near a crosswalk. The coffee spilled across the sidewalk. Half of it landed on a man's navy overcoat. Naomi immediately apologized and reached for napkins. The stranger looked down at the stain, then at her worried expression, and laughed. Not an irritated laugh. A genuine one. "I think the coat will survive," he said. That was how she met Alexander. There had been no luxury car waiting nearby. No entourage. No signs of wealth. Used to tall men standing in the rain, holding a ruined coffee cup and smiling like inconveniences were not personal attacks. They ended up talking for 20 minutes beneath the awning of a bookstore while the storm passed overhead. When they finally exchanged numbers, Naomi assumed she would never hear from him again. She was wrong. Alexander called 2 days later. Then again the following week. Their first dinner happened at a quiet restaurant overlooking Elliott Bay. Nothing extravagant. No attempt to impress. What Naomi noticed most was how carefully he listened. When she spoke, he paid attention. When she finished, he remembered details. After years of feeling invisible, that alone felt extraordinary. Months passed. Alexander never asked her to become someone different. He never compared her to anyone else. He never treated her achievements as competition. One evening, while walking along the waterfront as ferries crossed the dark water in the distance, Naomi finally told him the truth about her divorce. She expected awkwardness. Pity. Questions. Instead, Alexander simply listened. When she finished, he looked out across the harbor lights and said something she never forgot. Someone else's inability to value you does not reduce your value. No grand speech. No dramatic promise. Used quiet certainty. It was the kind of statement that sounded simple until it changed your life. Back at the wedding venue, guests continued taking their seats while the sky deepened into shades of orange and violet. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt water through the ceremony space. Ethan stood near the front speaking confidently with friends and relatives. Olivia laughed beside him as photographers captured another round of smiling pictures. Everything appeared perfect. Yet Naomi remained calm because she knew something none of them knew. They believed her story ended with a divorce. They believed they understood the entire picture because they had witnessed one chapter. What they did not understand was that the best parts of her life had happened after the chapter they remembered. Her phone remained silent now. No further messages. None were necessary. Somewhere nearby, Alexander was making his way toward the venue. And as Naomi watched the final rays of sunlight disappear beyond the Pacific horizon, she realized she was not waiting to be rescued. She was simply waiting for the man who had taught her what peace looked like. The first notes of the ceremony music drifted across the oceanfront venue as guests finally rose from their seats and turned their attention toward the flower-covered arch. The sky had deepened into a rich blend of purple and gold, and the waves below reflected the fading sunlight like sheets of polished glass. Naomi stood with the rest of the crowd, composed and elegant, her attention fixed ahead. Yet beneath the formal atmosphere, curiosity continued moving through the guests like an invisible current. The mystery surrounding her husband had become impossible to ignore. Ethan noticed it too. Every few minutes he caught someone glancing toward Naomi before looking at the entrance. It amused him. In his mind, anticipation only made the eventual disappointment more dramatic. He exchanged a confident smile with one of his friends and adjusted his cufflinks. Across the aisle, Olivia prepared for the ceremony, unaware that many conversations had quietly shifted away from the wedding itself. Then another memory surfaced in Naomi's mind. The night Alexander proposed. Not in a ballroom. Not in front of cameras. Not during some extravagant event designed to impress strangers. It happened on a quiet evening overlooking Lake Washington. The city lights shimmered across the water while sailboats rested peacefully in the distance. Alexander had spoken about the future the same way he spoke about everything important. Calmly. Thoughtfully. Without performance. He never treated commitment as a trophy. He treated it as a promise. That was the difference. Naomi remembered asking him one question before saying yes. Why me? Alexander had smiled. Because you stopped measuring yourself through other people's opinions long before you realized it. Even now, the memory warned her. Around here, guests settled back into their seats as the officiant stepped forward. The ceremony was seconds away from beginning. Then movement near the entrance drew attention from several people standing toward the rear of the venue. Nothing dramatic. Used subtle activity. A member of the event staff speaking quietly into an earpiece. A valet hurrying across the driveway. A security attendant straightening his posture. Most guests ignored it. Naomi did not. Her phone vibrated once more. She glanced down. Almost there. 2 simple words. Yet they carried complete certainty. She slipped the phone away and looked toward the entrance again. At the front, Ethan happened to catch the expression on her face. It bothered him more than he expected. Throughout the evening she had never appeared embarrassed. Never defensive. Never angry. The reaction he wanted never came. Instead, she carried herself like someone waiting for a train she knew would arrive exactly on schedule. The officiant welcomed everyone and began speaking. The audience focused forward. The ceremony officially started. But only a few minutes later, a quiet murmur began near the back rows. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. Even the officiant hesitated for a fraction of a second. One by one, people shifted in their seats toward the entrance. Ethan frowned and looked over his shoulder. Naomi remained perfectly still. For the first time all evening, she was not the one waiting. Someone else had arrived. The quiet murmur spreading through the audience grew stronger with every passing second. Guests who had been focused on the ceremony were now looking toward the entrance instead. The officiant paused politely, waiting for the distraction to settle. It did not. Near the back rows, several people stood slightly taller in their seats as though trying to get a better view. Ethan followed their gaze and frowned. Whatever had captured everyone's attention clearly was not part of the wedding schedule. Naomi remained calm. Her hands rested lightly in her lap. Her breathing never changed. The ocean breeze moved gently through the ceremony space, carrying the scent of salt water and fresh flowers across the gathering. Then Ethan made a mistake. Perhaps it was frustration. Perhaps it was pride. Whatever the reason, he turned toward Naomi and spoke just loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. Looks like your husband picked an interesting time to arrive. A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around them. Naomi simply looked at him. Traffic happens. Ethan laughed. Of course. Although if I were attending my wife's event, I probably would not be late. The comment landed exactly the way he intended. Several people shifted awkwardly in their seats. Olivia glanced toward him, clearly wishing he would stop. Yet Ethan continued. The attention of the crowd had become too tempting. Actually, he said, I am impressed. Most people would not have come at all. Naomi said nothing. It takes confidence to sit through this by yourself. The words sounded polite on the surface. Everyone understood they were not. For a brief moment, silence settled between them. Then Naomi smiled. Not a forced smile. Not an angry smile. A peaceful one. I am not by myself. Something about the certainty in her voice made Ethan look away first. It was a small moment, but several people noticed it. The murmurs near the entrance continued growing. More heads turned. More whispers spread through the crowd. A man seated near the front suddenly stood up. Ten anote. Ten anote. None of them appeared interested in the wedding anymore. They were staring toward whoever had arrived. Ethan noticed it too. His confidence began showing the first tiny crack of uncertainty. One of his business associates looked over his shoulder and immediately straightened his posture. Another guest quietly adjusted his jacket as if preparing to greet someone important. The reaction puzzled Ethan. Very few people could create that kind of response without saying a single word. Naomi already knew why. 2 years earlier, she had learned something fascinating about Alexander. The people who truly carried power rarely announced it. They entered a room and let everyone else figure it out. The whispers were no longer whispers now. Names were being exchanged. Questions were being asked. A few guests appeared genuinely shocked. A tense expression tightened. It turned fully toward the entrance. Across the aisle, Olivia did the same. The officiant stopped speaking altogether. The ceremony had effectively paused itself. Naomi looked toward the back of the venue and felt her heart warm. Not because of wealth. Not because of status. Because she recognized the familiar way he carried himself. Calm. Unhurried. Completely unaffected by the attention surrounding him. And as the crowd slowly parted to make room for the man walking forward, Ethan finally saw his face. The color drained from his expression almost instantly. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound was the distant crash of waves against the shoreline below the venue. Alexander Sterling walked forward with the same unhurried confidence he carried everywhere. He wore a dark tailored suit, simple and understated, yet his presence altered the atmosphere more effectively than any display of wealth ever could. The reactions around him told the story before anyone said a word. A senior executive seated near the front immediately stood. 2 investors exchanged stunned looks. A hotel owner Naomi vaguely recognized straightened his posture and quietly stepped aside. Ethan stared as if his mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. He knew that face. Everyone in his industry knew that face. Over the years, he had read interviews, watched keynote speeches, and followed business headlines connected to Alexander Sterling. Ethan had spent months trying to secure a meeting through professional contacts. The opportunity never came. And now the man he had spent years hoping to impress was walking directly toward Naomi. The realization landed slowly, then all at once. Olivia looked between Ethan and Alexander, sensing the shift without fully understanding it. Around them, whispers moved through the audience. That is Alexander Sterling. What is he doing here? How does Naomi know him? Wait, is that her husband? No one seemed interested in the ceremony anymore. Alexander reached Naomi's row and smiled the moment their eyes met. The expression on his face carried none of the tension filling the room. It was warm. Familiar. Genuine. I am sorry I am late, he said. The flight arrived on time. The traffic did not. A few guests laughed nervously. Naomi stood and gently touched his arm. You made it. Alexander looked at her as though the rest of the crowd did not exist. I told you I would. Then, Without hesitation, he placed a hand comfortably at the small of her back and turned toward the audience. The gesture lasted only a second. Yet it answered every question in the room. It was not a business associate. Not a friend. Not an acquaintance. It was her husband. The silence that followed felt almost surreal. A tense confidence had completely disappeared. The story he had spent the entire evening constructing collapsed without a single argument. No confrontation was necessary. No explanation was required. Reality had done all the work. One of the guests finally stepped forward to greet Alexander. Then another. And another. Within moments, several influential people were introducing themselves, shaking his hand, and welcoming him to the event. So many of them had barely acknowledged Naomi earlier. Now their attention had shifted entirely. Naomi noticed it. So did Ethan. But the most remarkable thing was Alexander's response. He greeted everyone politely, then returned his attention to Naomi. As though she remained the most important person there. Not the investors. Not the executives. Not the admirers. Here. Ethan watched the interaction unfold from only a few yards away. For the first time all evening, he looked uncertain. Not because Alexander was wealthy. Not because Alexander was powerful. But because the way Alexander looked at Naomi revealed something Ethan had never truly understood. Value is easiest to recognize after you lose it. And standing beneath the fading California sky, Ethan was finally beginning to understand exactly what he had lost. The ceremony eventually resumed, but the atmosphere never returned to what it had been before. Something had shifted. Not because Alexander had spoken about his accomplishments. Not because he had tried to impress anyone. In fact, he had done the opposite. After greeting a few guests, he quietly took the seat beside Naomi and directed his attention back toward the wedding. The simplicity of it somehow carried more weight than any grand entrance ever could. Around them, conversations became softer. More careful. People who had once looked at Naomi with sympathy now looked at her with curiosity. Yet Naomi seemed completely unaffected by the change. She had not come there to prove anyone wrong. She had not come for revenge. She had simply come because she was no longer afraid of her past. As the ceremony continued beneath the fading California sky, Ethan remained unusually quiet. For the first time all evening, he had no clever remarks. No confident smile. No audience. Every assumption he had made about Naomi's life had been based on a story he invented for himself. A story in which he was the winner and she was the lesson left behind. Reality turned out to be very different. When the ceremony ended and guests began moving toward the reception area, Alexander stood and offered his hand to Naomi. She accepted it with a smile. Together, they walked through the crowd. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just naturally. Several people stopped them to say hello. Others introduced themselves. Alexander was gracious to everyone. But each time a conversation ended, his attention returned to Naomi. As though she remained the center of his world. Near the reception entrance, Ethan finally crossed paths with them. For a moment, all three stood beneath the glow of string lights hanging above the courtyard. The ocean breeze moved gently through the evening air. Ethan looked at Naomi. Then at Alexander. Then back at Naomi again. It seemed as though he wanted to say something important. An apology. An explanation. Maybe even a question. Instead, he simply nodded. Naomi returned the gesture with quiet kindness. No bitterness. No triumph. No need to reopen old chapters. Some victories do not require words. Alexander gently placed his hand over hers and guided her toward the waiting car at the edge of the property. The driver opened the door. Naomi paused briefly and looked back one final time. The wedding lights shimmered in the distance. Guests laughed. Music drifted across the courtyard. Life continued. Then she stepped inside. The door closed softly behind her. As the car disappeared into the California night, Ethan remained standing beneath the lights, watching the taillights fade beyond the curve of the road. And for the first time, he understood something success had never taught him. She did not win him back. She won herself.